Hello, Healing Overflow with Dr. Toy family. It's so good to see y'all again. Y'all look good. Y'all got a little suntan. Where y'all been? I hope you've had great vacations and time to rest and take care of yourself. You know, Healing Overflow is all about taking care of yourself and taking care of other people. I am so excited today. I got to get some things out the way, but I can't wait to introduce my guest that I've been trying to get on the show. I've been waiting for this day. So I'm so excited all day long, all night long, y'all. He's here. All right, real quick, ask a therapist. You know what to do. Email me directly at toyaj@pitt.edu. Ask a therapist. I'm the therapist. I'm going to answer your question. And then we're going to work together to help you out. Thank you for sending in your questions. Y'all went banana nut on me, and I have so many questions. I'm going to do another episode. Y'all asked for that. Healing Overflow with Dr. Toy, Ask a Therapist episode. It's coming. Don't worry about it. I got you, fam. All right, here we go, y'all. I have Ron Idoko here from the Pitt social work program, but also he has so many. You know what? You remind me of an octopus. I love studying animals, sea animals and things, and the octopus is the brightest, and they have all these little tentacles doing all kind of things. That's you.
Yep, got my arms everywhere and everything.
And doing everything you're so passionate about so much. So I'm going to have my audience put their hands together for you first. Is that all right?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Appreciate it.
Ron is here. Ron, you're my colleague. I definitely look at you as the office buddy, a bro. Like, you are the coolest cat, if I may age myself a bit and use terms that my dad used to use, coolest cat around the office. But I watch you, and I watch how you move, and you move with such grace and passion and care and love for the community and for people and for students. And so I knew that I needed your wisdom on the show, and I needed you to come and talk about all the stuff that you're involved in. I'm super proud and excited when I see you do things. You're winning, but you're not just keeping winning to yourself. You're allowing other people to sit at the table, eat, win, everybody around you. And so I just want the audience, and I want social work, Pitt social work to know, and all of my family, my Healing Overflow family, been rolling with me since the pandemic. I love y'all. I want them to get to know you, those that don't have the pleasure of knowing you. But those that do know you, you're going to get to know so much more about Ron. So tell us who you are, where'd you come from? You just dropped up in the social work program like, ta-da!
You know what? First off, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Of course.
I've been a long-time admirer of your work. You know, I'm a big fan of folks who take the time to help explain some of our challenges and help empower us. So many, many kudos to you doing this incredible work.
I didn't even pay him to say that, y'all. See, that's my bro.
No, it's all true. But just some background on me. You know, I came to Pitt by way of the Bronx, New York. I was a Pitt undergrad, Pitt master's, but I came here about 20 years ago, dating myself, from New York, having grown up in the Bronx, the son of Nigerian immigrants, which was very core to my experience growing up, and really just learning about a world, you know, that at times I felt like I didn't quite fit in because of some of the things that I was exposed to growing up and the culture that I grew up in. And so just some additional background. Growing up as a Nigerian American, there were a lot of expectations for me. You know, really the idea that I can succeed at anything, that, you know, my parents had this expectation that I was always going to be a high achiever. You know, it was one of those things where, you know, I'd get a 95 on the test. You know, I'd be really excited, go home, show my parents my grades, and be like, where are the other 5 points? You know?
Oh, no.
You know, it was that type of environment. But I really, you know, appreciated the fact that they had high expectations for me, because it put me in a position to have high expectations for myself, which growing up, I realized that wasn't the case for everybody. You know, particularly for a lot of young black kids that look like me, where I could start to sense there was a difference in the things that I was experiencing and what they were experiencing. I was always an observer. You know, I was always someone who just wanted to see and observe what people were doing, how were they navigating spaces, how they were reacting to each other. with just trying to understand what it meant, to be Black or Nigerian or whatever identity I could think of in those spaces, and what it meant to be in those spaces with people who did have different identities. And so for me, it was always just really trying to understand what life meant for me and what were my possibilities. And I think as part of that sort of growing up, that's where I started to become really aware of the differences of growing up, in an African household, a Black person in an African household versus just, perhaps someone who might have a longer lineage in this country as a Black person, and started to shape my experiences on how we think about ourselves and our possibilities. And so that was something that influenced my decision when I was going to college, is that, I wanted to see more environments. I wanted to see something beyond the space that I grew up in. I wanted to see how other people interacted, what were other sort of cultures beyond the one I experienced in New York. And I thought I was going to a bunch of places around the country, and I ended up at Pitt. And I'll say this, it was one of the best choices for me because it gave me an opportunity to go to a place that was a really great school. Pitt is a great school, but wasn't too far from home. So I had an opportunity to go back home. And to the extent that one of the things when I did here, I played football, I had an opportunity, to join the team and walk on, and that was a great experience for me. And
now I have to say, when I snoop
Yeah.
about my guest, I
Yeah.
saw that little football picture.
Yeah,
I
my
said,
little football
"Look at
picture.
Ron."
Yeah. Well, that was a big part of my experience because, I really learned the importance of practice. Like, if you want to be really good at something, the amount of practice and effort that you have to put into it, and the idea of teamwork, right? That if you want to achieve collectively, you really have to be in a position to communicate well with teammates and understand each other, look out for each other, support each other. And so those were fundamental values that I really appreciated, which again, continue to shape my life, really continue to put me in a position to think deeply about the things I wanted to do for myself and the amount of effort that I would have to put in to achieve at a high level. So those were all core to my experience, and that led me down the path of wanting to do work, oddly enough, in education, because I found education as a space where obviously learning is the fundamental goal. And like I said, I like to observe, I like to learn, but also to the extent where the things that I was learning, I wanted to share. That's what really sort of propelled me to be in this space. I started off, working in for-profit education. That was not a great chapter.
No,
For-profit,
thank you.
Yeah, no thank you. But then had an opportunity to come back to Pitt where, I worked in the alumni office for a few years, which, if you can imagine, they made me the alumni ambassador, where I would travel all around the country, get to meet with different alumni, talk about their experiences, get to connect with them, better understand, what they experienced during their time at Pitt, and also what were the possibilities that they were exploring, based on their education here. And it really helped me learn how to engage people across all sorts of differences. Because in that work, I was literally connecting with folks who just graduated, in April, and folks who graduated 60 years ago, right, across all sorts of racial identities, gender identities, all sorts of unique identities. And it became clear to me that most people tend to want the same thing. We all want to sort of just find ways to thrive and prosper and look out for ourselves and each other. And it became clear a lot of the challenges that we do have is that we don't often know how to communicate across our differences.
Oh, yeah. So when did you learn? I'm a Black American. I've gone through a lot of racism. There's stories. And I want to get to where you knew, being Nigerian American, knowing there's a race issue. There's something, because no one said, hey, are you American? Are you Nigerian? And then, no, you're Black. You look Black. And so there you go. You're getting a racism. Except the Bronx and Pittsburgh are like two different places.
Very different.
I love the bird, but, we got, the Bronx, there's a lot of racial, it's a melting pot. In Pittsburgh, not so much. I grew up in Pittsburgh and it wasn't a melting pot. It looks more like it now. So when did you know, coming to Pittsburgh had to be like a little bit of a culture shock. So you could talk about that. But how did you know, we have a race issue and I'm going to be in the forefront of leading, education, and we're gonna get into your whole program. It's dynamite, y'all. I can't wait till you hear about it. But like, how did you know this is? Your parents knew you were destined for greatness. This is great stuff you're doing. So how'd you know this is what I'm supposed to do? This is my thing now.
Yeah. So I would say, as I was working in the alumni department, one of the things that I became very sort of just in tune with was really seeing the different experiences that folks had across their identities and recognizing there was a difference, particularly for a lot of Black and brown folks. And so I wanted to be more engaged in figuring out, well, how do we create spaces in which they could actually thrive? What are the issues? What are the barriers? And so when I was working in alumni, I decided to become the chair of Equipoise, which is the Black faculty and staff group at the university. And that put me in a position to hear from a lot of people, about the different issues they were facing, the different challenges, the experiences that we're having, and it became clear to me that even at an institution, with a really lot of smart people and with a lot of folks who are, dedicated to wanting to make the world a better place, we still had very significant issues in terms of how Black and brown folks were experiencing this place,
Absolutely.
right? Whether people were experiencing challenges of not feeling like they belonged, right? Or to the extent where they were dealing with bias, whether explicit or implicit. And so I wanted to figure out, well, how do I address that? And so in the work that I was doing with Equipoise, I just became very active in saying, like, hey, I want to talk to whoever about these issues, right? And
take me to your leader.
You know what? And honestly, it was one of those things where I never wanted to approach it from like a hostile or a frustrated sort of place. It was more like, I'm pretty sure they're rational people that if I could explain to them what other people are experiencing, they would want to work with us to figure out how we make the place better, right? I've always had this sort of assumption that most people will engage in good faith if I approach in good faith.
Is that what you encountered?
For the most part, yeah.
Really?
So honestly, this is part of what I think has made my journey so rewarding. It was that because I was so active in wanting to connect and address these issues, when a position opened up in the office it was back then the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the person who had the role for diversity and multicultural programs was like, Ron, you've been so active on this. I really think you'd be really great for this role. And so I was like, I think you're right. I think I would be good at this. And so, again, it was one of those first things where I really learned that just being active and present would open up the door for opportunity, and that folks, could see, my sort of forthright desire to make things better and that they would provide me with the spaces to make the work happen. And so I transitioned over to the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and had an opportunity to create programs for the university that, again, spoke to the values that we espouse, in our mission, and really being mindful that the change I wanted to see had to happen actively, but also collectively. And so I was always really interested in trying to connect with folks in different departments, different communities, to figure out, where can we collaborate on programming? How do we, create resources that help us better understand each other? How do we ensure that people can get the most meaningful experience possible and not be hindered because of their identity? Yeah. And as I was doing that work, the one thing that happened, which I think everyone, was impacted, was the murder of George Floyd.
Right.
And, after that, the university wanted to make a very clear commitment to being anti-racist. And as I thought through what that meant, it became clear to me that the most meaningful way to uphold that sort of value was to ensure that everyone actually understood what it meant, because that was, I think, one of the primary barriers that I encountered when I would try to have conversations about racism with other folks, that most folks didn't really understand it, and I myself at a certain time didn't always really understand it. I remember how much reading, how much sort of reflecting I had to do to really understand the systemic nature of racism, right? To go beyond the idea of someone just being explicitly mean or, engaging in microaggressions, and to really think about, well, what does this mean on a structural level? What does this mean on a systemic level? And as I was doing that work and really building my own knowledge, it became clear to me, I'm like, wait, if I have to do this as a person who works in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, right, I can only imagine how the rest of the folks on campus, might be relatively underprepared to engage on this issue. And so, again, my goal was to say in good faith, I believe that most of us simply don't know how to effectively address racism because most of us have never been socialized to talk about it. Most of us have never been educated on the topic.
Whoa.
And that was like a very sort of clear point of entry for me to say, well, if I can really help people build their understanding of the issue, help them understand how complex and pervasive the issue is, but also really guide them towards tools that help them rethink the society towards equity, that we all be in a much better position. Because ultimately, what I could not do was to create policies and initiatives for every single department. That just was not realistic.
No.
Because everyone does, the work looks so different in so many different spaces. But at the very least, if you can give people a fundamental understanding of the issue and help them understand that, hey, maybe through no fault of your own, most of us haven't been socialized to really engage this topic effectively, but we can change that sort of situation. We can put ourselves in a much better position to engage if we take the time to effectively learn about it, but also learn how to communicate our understanding with each other.
More of the approaches I've seen is, okay, you talked about being socialized. Well, most society, black, brown, white, have been socialized towards racism.
Yes.
Let's put everyone in hierarchies. Let's make sure that these folks are treated more special. Let's make sure these folks know that they are not special enough. That's how it's been. And you're saying, we don't have time to focus on this. We have to focus on what the solution is. Let's look at where we can get to because we don't need taught about racism. We don't need taught that I was kicked out of a store because I was black, or that I was called the N-word by my friend's parents. And you don't need to teach me that. You don't need to teach you that. But what needs to be taught is what? Like, what are you looking for folks to learn? What do we need to be taught?
Yeah, and again, I tell folks it's really, we all need to learn the fundamentals of the society that we live in. I mean, to the point you just made, we are all born into a society that is racist, right? And when I say that it is racist, I'm not saying that the society is full of a bunch of bad people that want to cause harm. I mean, certainly that might be an aspect of it. I'm saying that we're born into a society where people experience significant inequity. We're born into a society where there are significant disparities based on race and other aspects of identity, all right, that have been well structured before any of us arrived here, right? And in many ways, we've been socialized to maintain the status quo, because the other part that, again, I think is fundamental to our challenge is that we're socialized not to talk about it. We're socialized not to talk effectively about how systemic racism operates in our society.
Well, there's bans. Get that book out of here.
Well, it's exactly.
We're not teaching it in class.
You've got bans, and you have that sort of, speaking to the ideology of colorblindness, you have that sort of ideology that says the best way to get rid of racism is not to talk about it, to look away from it, right, to avoid it.
Right.
And we know that's just simply not effective. If anything, it works in favor of racism to do nothing in the face of racism. Right. And so I think, again, part of what I try to get people to do is just have an honest reflection. Ask yourself, think about your formative education. Think about in high school. Think about even perhaps when you went to college. Ask yourself, when did you learn about systemic racism? When did you actually learn how society was shaped? When did you learn how it impacts people in education, in healthcare, in justice, in economic opportunity? And most folks, if they have that honest reflection, will be like, I don't think I ever had that, right?
I'm like, no, never. I mean, when I became a social worker.
Well, you see, right? And
that's it.
And think about that, right? And so we have a society in which most folks are not positioned to understand the fundamental problem that causes so much inequity.
But why would I want to understand if I'm benefiting from the racist, systemic racism? I'm benefiting, I'm the 1%, or I have this pyramid scheme idea that if I do this, this, and this, I'm going to be at the top as well. Like what? You know what I mean? Like, why would I want to learn about racism or how to eliminate, or I wonder if that's your terminology, to eliminate racism or educate people about how do you phrase that? But I'm looking at the people in power, the dominant race, the people that call the shots and do the laws, and why would I want to learn about this? Because it's working for me.
Well, I mean, if we actually take a step back, what we realize, racism actually doesn't work for most people. It actually puts a lot of people, particularly a lot of people in the dominant group, a lot of white folks, to experience unnecessary harm, right, through neglect, if anything. And so what do I mean? Take, for example, when we look at data, that speaks to states or regions, that have low numbers in terms of educational attainment, or have poor healthcare outcomes or poor economic outcomes, right? That you see a lot of states that are impacted, or a lot of regions that are impacted, right, are places that certainly might have a solid population of black and brown folks, but also a lot of white folks. And in many ways, there are a lot of white folks that get left behind because, right, in many ways, they've been led to believe that their biggest challenge or their biggest threat to their success, right, are those people, the black and brown people, versus the policy and the power that has kept them in poverty, or has, not provided any sort of meaningful resources to ensure that they have any level of meaningful social mobility, right? There's a great book by Heather McGhee called The Sum of Us, where she talks about the fact that in many ways our society has been designed to really bestow benefit to a small group of people, right? Particularly those who have power and those who are sort of deeply rooted in the structure. But for most people, you don't see those benefits, and so in reality, we want to get folks to understand that most people, by far, again, even a lot of white folks, don't benefit from systemic racism.
This is the education. This is the education that we need. Because then you'll realize, I'm not benefiting from racism. I'm actually being hurt by it.
Absolutely.
The majority of society are being hurt by racism, not benefiting.
I mean, and you've heard the different platitudes and the different sort of sayings that, a society in which you allow anyone to experience injustice becomes an injustice to all over time, right? And so we know that we have to be much more mindful of the fact that our fates are bound up together, right? And that when we create a society in which everyone can thrive, that means everyone can thrive, right? But when you create a society in which people are divided across their differences, you certainly create the space for more suffering, for more oppression, right? For more people to not experience what it means to live a fulfilling life, right? And so we have to be, I think, extra intentional about saying that everyone needs to do the work of envisioning a world in which we can all thrive across our differences, and understand that part of the barrier towards that vision is the system that is in place that makes it difficult for us to engage across our differences, right? That maintains, these systems of inequity, that maintains hierarchies of human value, which, again, I think if you talk to most people don't want to see people suffer. No. Most people, most human beings, right, don't really want other people to suffer, particularly just based on how they were born into the world, right? But the challenge is that most folks don't understand the systems that put people in a position to suffer.
Correct.
Right? And so it's very difficult to solve a problem you've never been educated on, particularly one as complex as systemic racism.
Y'all know what I say. This is some gold nugget moments. Like light switches go on. Because you're like, I don't want to learn about racism. I experienced it. I lived it. I'm actually angry about it. I want to approach it with the by any means necessary. I want to fight. Because I'm tired of being oppressed. I'm tired,
Yeah.
And you're saying we have to frame it, not even frame it. We have to look at it and dig into the truth.
Yes.
The truth about it, and learn it so that we're approaching it a different way. Your approach is not that like tear it down, blow it up approach. What's really like, what? Because I'm an activist. I'm like, where are we about to go? And you're like, yeah, we're going to advocate. You're an activist, but you're leading with, it's a calm. It's a peace. There's some joy in there. I was like, what are you doing? Like, what?
I'm just centering liberation. And part of what I've realized, too, again, in my own sort of study, my own reflection, is that when you look at the folks that have been, I think, most effective in moving our society forward, right, whether you're looking at the MLKs or the Rosa Parks, right, of the world, or even the Harriet Tubmans, that part of what they truly center in their work isn't fear or anger or frustration at the others. It's centering love and joy and balance for both ourselves and everyone.
Even Malcolm X ended there.
Indeed.
He started with tearing it down.
Absolutely.
And then said, this is the approach I'm going to go.
I mean, I'm a big fan of Audre Lorde. She says you can't use the master's tools, right? And so you can't fight fear with fear, anger with anger, hate with hate. It doesn't really work. All you do is perpetuate more of the same.
Yes.
Right? And so the goal is to say, well, if you want to do this work, and perhaps do it for the long run, sustain yourself, truly put yourself in a position to make change happen over time, you have to really center those elements that allow you to feel most human,
Yeah.
right? Which is, again, love,
Yeah.
right? Because once you truly love yourself, regardless of whatever sort of message the society tries to sort of embed within you, you know that you become more resistant, right? That you know you can't tell me I'm not capable because I know myself. You can't tell me that I'm this or that because I know who I am, because I love myself. And because I know how to love myself, I know how to extend love to others.
Yes.
Truly and meaningfully across all these differences.
And people will receive that
People
more
receive
than
that.
like, you did this and you did that.
I mean,
like, I don't want to feel guilty no more. I don't want to feel, no one's receiving that. And research shows it's not effective.
It's not effective.
It's not.
I mean, honestly, all we got to do is just think practically. I tell folks, my thing is, even though I speak to this work in a, perhaps really robust and visionary way, I'm like, I try to be very practical about this. And so, to your point, I used to have my days back in the day where, as I was learning, I felt like I got some knowledge, and anyone that ever tried to sort of question me, I would break them over the head with knowledge, I'd come at them, and then I would find that, those people or those friends sometimes wouldn't call me back or become a little bit more avoidant, and I had to reflect on myself. I was like, was I truly engaging in a way that was bringing me closer to people, or was I just really being self-righteous and actually led to me, being more separated?
And your Timberland
Well,
boots.
right?
Ready.
And again, so I had to have a sort of practical moment with myself to say, well, most people probably don't learn through condescension or antagonism. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like I know I don't learn that way. I don't know. I wouldn't receive if someone's trying to just
Correct.
bash me over the head. And so I had to say, like, you know what? This is where I need to practice empathy. That I have to be mindful of what it means to engage in a way that doesn't push people away, right? And how do I engage in a way that brings us closer together? And so it really reminded me that, the best teachers I ever had in my life were very kind, compassionate, empathetic, loving, right? And understood that mistakes do happen, particularly when you're engaging with people who don't really understand the issue well enough, right? That you have to create the space for people to really engage on the topic in a safe way, and so that they can actually grow, right? That they can grow their knowledge, they can grow their awareness, they can grow their skill sets to do the work. Which means you have to be an effective, loving sort of educator. You have to be willing to lead with love, right? And so that hopefully, again, that spreads because, if you're not creating the space in which people feel safe in learning and in which they feel safe in connecting with you, again, chances are you're losing the opportunity to really, again, build what I think is the most important sort of aim of the work is to perfect our human connections.
Yeah.
Is to figure out how we get better together. And so if you don't create the environment in which we can share and learn, right, that you're making it difficult to do that, which I think is the end work, to figure out how we do this together.
I absolutely can attest to this because I've not been receptive of very many type, I'm like, oh, that's nice. We're going to eliminate racism. You can't. There's more people that want it here, but I've actually listened to what you had to say because the way you laid it out. And then I said, oh, what's he saying? I was a believer that you can't intellectualize racism. It's emotional. There's too much damage that has been done. Then I went through your modules and kind of looked through and I said, he's not intellectualizing racism. This is an opportunity for us to learn what we have never learned before. And it really is. I'm going to tell y'all about Ron. Like, he has charisma. You want to listen. He's intelligent. And then you wonder, okay, once I get in there, is it going to be fluff and puff and cotton candy? Or is it going to have some girth in the content? And I found that the content really has some girth. You did research.
Yeah.
You studied your behind off. Like, you really went in there and you did the work. And I was really like, oh, it was a relief. Almost to look at it and go through the modules. So I want you to talk about the modules because they're probably like, what's she talking about?
Yeah.
But I want you to talk about the vaccine of racism. Yeah. How in the world did you come up with that name? Because I've heard one person talk about not liking the name for whatever reason. And I was wondering, like, well, I actually like the name. I thought it was really catchy and I kind of got it when I heard it. But I want you to talk about why you came up with that or who came up with how you did that. But break down the modules I saw the CBT components in there. I'm a CBTer, y'all. I teach CBT. I study it. I love the Beck Institute. And so I was like, ooh, because CBT has a lot of research behind it. So it's, its efficacy it's there. So
Yeah.
I was like, oh, this really has some teeth. So I want you to kind of break this down. I'm going to let you just kind of go through it and say whatever you want there. But it's pretty impressive. So I want you to talk about it.
For sure. And so, sort of speaking to the work, what was fundamental in my approach to addressing this was really understanding it. And so one of the most fascinating things that I came about when I was doing my research was how many scholars that would refer to racism as a virus, right? And there were really some very powerful scholars. There was a researcher out of Harvard, David, I think Washington, and I apologize if I get his last name wrong, that did this talk for one of the federal health agencies. And in watching the talk, it became very clear to me as he framed racism as a virus, how racism is a very unique social virus in the ways in which it's sort of metastasized throughout society, how it's passed on primarily through unconscious behaviors. And so again, like I mentioned, what was clear is that we're all socialized into a society where racism is the norm, it's the status quo. And in many ways, we're socialized to maintain society as it is, right? We're socialized to sort of carry forth the similar traditions that we were born into. And particularly when it comes to racism, the idea, like I mentioned, of being colorblind makes people not just blind to racism, but in many ways puts them in a position to actively perpetuate it, right? When you pass on certain biases and behaviors, right, from one generation to the next, right? When you engage, whether with family, friends, colleagues, in behaviors where you're passing on stereotypes or microaggressions, right, unknowingly, right, that in many ways we're socialized to pass this virus on unknowingly because so much of it happens unknowingly because so many of us simply don't know that we are passing this on because we haven't been educated on how it works, right? And so in that sense, when I really became clear on how racism operates as a social virus, it became clear to me that the sort of foundational approach to inoculating yourself, the foundational sort of vaccine truly is deep consciousness of how it works. Right, because the more conscious you are of how an issue works, particularly racism, right, the more you can consciously work to address it within yourself and certainly within your environment, within the different communities where you have an influence, right? But if you never build that conscious awareness of it, then you, again, are more likely to pass it on, to perpetuate it, right? It's going to influence your decision making. It's going to influence, perhaps, if you're in a position to create policy, it's going to influence your policy making. It's going to influence how you engage in an institution. And so if you're not doing that work of becoming deeply conscious of it, right, that you might, again, unknowingly continue to perpetuate it. And so my goal was to say, well, how do we help people become deeply conscious of this thing, right? Because, again, we're in an environment where, you can't put everyone into a particular classroom, at least right off the bat. And so how do you create a framework for people to think about this, right? So at the very least, they can help sort of grow themselves, give them a sort of personal change model. And so that's where I started looking at different models and interventions focused on addressing maladaptive behavior, because that's what it is, right? It's a maladaptive behavior. That is a behavior that we are socialized into that works against, our sort of conscious values, our conscious decision making, and that unless we work to address it, right, that it always sort of lingers this issue. Right. And so as I was looking at different models of addressing maladaptive behavior, CBT became one of the first things that was just very clear to me. I was like, okay, if there's something that clearly works, CBT is probably like one of the most evidence-based, data-driven approaches to addressing maladaptive behavior, right? And often it's the case that people leverage it to address depression or, significant anxiety. And so as I was thinking about it more, it became clear to me that part of our challenge around racism was a little bit of anxiety, particularly racial anxiety, where people feel perhaps challenged in engaging on the topic, particularly with people across different races, and that can often lead to those reactions you're talking about, wanting to fight or maybe run away from the conversation or not being sure of what to do in those moments. And so I wanted to learn, how do you leverage this intervention perhaps in a more sort of instructional way, right? Because obviously I'm not addressing any particular sort of mental health challenge, but I am addressing maladaptive behavior. Right. And so as I investigated more, I learned about this sort of instructional derivative of CBT, which is SCBT, Structured Cognitive Behavioral Training. and it sounds like a mouthful, but it is pretty straightforward. It's just a systematic approach to addressing behavior within oneself, right? It puts you in a position to have a methodological approach about understanding yourself deeply and then thinking about behaviors that you value and then learning how to embody those behaviors, right? And so it's actually very practical in that sense. And so I thought about, well, how can I use this method, SCBT, to help people become more active in cultivating racial equity? And so I started, as part of my research, studying what are the most common or well understood behaviors that work toward racial equity. And as I was doing that, I outlined what we call the Structured Cognitive Behavioral Training Framework for Racial Equity Consciousness Development. That is, I wanted to identify behaviors that not only work towards racial equity, but in many ways were sort of reciprocal, right? And so that people can see the benefit of engaging one behavior and how it leads to support of another behavior. And so as I was studying that, it became very clear that there were certain behaviors that were regarded as necessary or fundamental towards cultivating racial equity. And when I talk about racial equity, I talk about those processes of eliminating racial disparities and improving outcomes for everyone. Mm-hmm. That, again, I think people need to have a fundamental understanding that there's more than just one process, mm-hmm. right, to eliminate racial disparities and improve outcomes for everyone, that we can think of all the unique processes that we can engage personally and collectively. And so in helping people think about how to develop those processes, the idea was, well, let's focus on the behaviors that work towards developing those processes. Right. And so as I was going through the work, it became clear that there were certain behaviors that were necessary, like being able to recognize racial depression. Right. As I mentioned, if you want to be able to address an issue, you have to be able to see it. You have to. You have to see it. Right. And you have to see how it operates, not just on the interpersonal level, mm-hmm. which is most familiar to folks, but how does it operate on the individual level? How do you internalize it?
That's right.
Right. But then how does it operate on an institutional level? What does it look like in policy? Right. What does it look like in the practices of an institution? And then you have to also recognize it in ideology. Like I mentioned, colorblindness, you have to recognize that works towards racism.
That's not,
you know what I'm saying?
It's not positive that you don't see me.
You know what I'm saying, right? And so you have to recognize those things.
Exactly.
That was a fundamental behavior that people need to know how to engage in that behavior of recognizing racial oppression, right? But then there are other behaviors like being able to examine racial identity. That is, examine the meaning and significance of what it means to have a particular racial identity. Because we know in many ways, there are certain things that are ascribed to certain people based on identity mm-hmm. that we don't often sort of reflect on. And so giving people the tools to examine, well, what does it mean for me to be Black in this space, in this environment? What has been the historical sort of significance and the contemporary sort of understanding of that identity, and giving people the tools to think critically about themselves, recognizing too that when you think about identity, that your identity is not just a race. It makes up all those other factors, those intersecting factors, your gender, your socioeconomic status, the culture you grew up in, giving people the tools to examine that, to understand how do you think about yourself and how do you think about other people? Where does that come from? Right? That's a core behavior that people need to learn to engage, to work towards equity. Or the idea of embracing racial diversity. Again, it sounds almost trite and sort of like simple, but what does it mean to actively embrace the inclusion of all people, right? How do you actively do that? What does that look like in reality? Yeah. It's easy to say.
Ignoring differences.
Exactly,
You're like,
right?
No. Differences, we should applaud that.
Absolutely,
we should celebrate this.
Right? And these are things that, again, my goal was to say, these are practical, but again, because we weren't educated, we got to learn how to do this. Like, what does it mean to be a champion for racial justice, right? We always hear the term, we need racial justice. Okay, well, how do I actually make that happen?
How do I do it?
How do I do it, right? How do I become a champion for racial justice? How do I gauge the inequities, the racial inequities in an environment, realizing that in many ways, racism is often hidden because we don't have data, or people are not aware of the data to show the disparities that exist in any environment. So how do I work to collect data, analyze it, and tell the story, right? Or what does it mean to acknowledge racial trauma? Realizing we live in a society where, again, because of the way racism works, that it has distinct physical, mental, emotional impacts on people, right? If I've never been educated on that, how would I even know? Yeah. Right? Like,
I'll pass it down.
Exactly.
Generational racial trauma, because I've never been educated.
I've never been educated. I've never positioned myself to actually understand how I've been impacted, right? And so there are all these behaviors that became very clear. It's like, hey, unless you learn how to actively engage this behavior, you're going to be challenged in your ability to cultivate racial equity. And so my goal was to say, well, let's make the behaviors not just understandable, but let's give resources behind them, right? Let's get people the tools to really understand, where am I at right now? when it comes to perhaps practicing and embodying these behaviors, and what are the tools that I can reflect on to educate myself so that I can take what I've learned and then improve my ability, right, to act on behaviors that are connected to my values, right? And so really for me, what became clear was that you have to create a model that allows people to understand themselves fully, and so that they can be the best agents, not just in terms of their personal growth, but the growth of the communities around them, right? And so racial equity consciousness, the way we define it, is the dispositions, the knowledge, the awareness, and skills that empower people. And I focus on empowerment to really contemplate, that is, think through and cultivate racial equity, right? That is the dispositions, knowledge, awareness, and skills to help people develop those processes of eliminating racial disparities and improving outcomes for everyone. Right. And when I think about the model, I often start with dispositions. That is, what are your attitudes, your beliefs toward a world in which everybody can thrive? You have to make that clear for yourself. Right, that you have to be willing to, speak up at any time about why you're doing this. You need to be clear with yourself. Why do I care? Why am I motivated, right, towards a world in which everyone can thrive? Because ultimately, if you're not clear with yourself, that it's going to be very difficult for you to find the necessary sort of drivers within yourself to do the work.
From that point.
You can't. You need those drivers to make it clear for yourself. Right, you have to have your own sort of personal North Star in this work. You have to have your own sort of guiding vision, a guiding force. And so that's why I start with dispositions. And obviously knowledge. As I mentioned, so many of us are undereducated on this topic, right? That, I often reflect on a comment that I heard from an educator where he shared so many people will tell you they're not racist. They're not racist.
Right.
But, the same people, when you ask them, well, what is systemic racism? They can't define it. Right? And so,
not me.
it's definitely not me. Whatever it is, it's definitely not me. And so getting people, again, to understand that you have to have the historical, social, political context around what racism actually is so that you can see it for what it is, particularly in the environment around you.
And let me tell y'all, because he knows probably already. Let me tell you that CBT is the educative treatment modality, which means you start with educating the client, the community, the group, whoever you're giving it to. You start with educating them about the way that their brain is working.
Absolutely.
When you were thinking, you have a precipitating event, and what you think about that, your perception about it, produces that emotion, then produces that behavior. Did y'all hearing this?
Yes.
Like, this is evidence-based stuff, which
Absolutely.
really makes it substantial, especially with intellects. Well, wow, where you get this from? Well, actually,
that's the best part of it.
Glad you asked.
I said that's the best part of it. It's not me. I said it's all these other scientists and
it's
scholars
science.
and activists.
It's there.
It's just there. And honestly, I tell folks, just think about it practically. Right, I tell folks, think about what it means to have pursued a bachelor's degree, right? That in many ways,
BASW?
a BASW, right? Right. In many ways, to do so effectively, that you have to really train your dispositions, that is your attitudes and beliefs towards that discipline. You have to increase your knowledge. You have to build your awareness of how that discipline works, right? And the ways in which you navigate the space, and certainly your skill sets. Right. And so all that to say is that people do this all the time. That is, they develop their consciousness towards things they care about. Right. They do so, like perhaps even if you're someone who plays a musical instrument, right, that if you want to get to the point of playing it well, you have the amount of practice that you have to put in, right, so that you can get to the point where you can play it without thinking.
That's right.
Our goal is to say, if you can give people the tools necessary, right, to grow on their own, to practice on their own, that naturally over time, their ability to effectively engage in cultivating racial equity will happen naturally, right? It becomes automatic. You change their subconscious behavior, right? And I think it's important for folks to understand we all have this capacity, right? It can be easy to say the work of social justice is for the social workers, right? Or for the activists, or for the folks who deeply care about a particular issue, right? That we're always perhaps positioned to think someone else is going to handle it versus saying like, well, no, you have the same capacity.
Or it's too big.
It's too big. It's too much, right? Which, Brian Stevenson, I think, shared best that hopelessness is the enemy of justice, right? Because wherever hopelessness persists, right, that's where you continue to see inequity and injustice, right? Because people have chosen to do
There's
nothing.
no mobility.
Exactly.
You're just standing there. You're scared stiff.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so
you have to start somewhere.
You have to start somewhere, and you have to start within yourself. And
Right.
so that was the whole sort of design of the framework, is to give people the tools necessary to do the work of imagining a world in which they can all thrive. Realizing, again, that you have to have a narrative behind this work. Like, what is your story?
Yeah.
Right? Like, what is
Yeah.
your story when it comes to the world you want to live in, right? And what is your story in terms of the work that you're doing to make that change happen? What is your vision of a world in which everybody can thrive, right? What are you actually working towards, right? And then what are you committed to doing differently? You know, and I tell folks, we put people in a position to reflect on these things consistently across those cognitive behaviors that I described, and so that they can actually feel much more connected to the idea of the work for themselves, relevant to whatever community or space that they're in, realizing the work will look different in whatever space that you're in because, you know, racism is apparent everywhere in our society. And so we need everyone on board to do the work. And we need folks to really think through, again, what does that look like for me? What are the stories I'm prepared to tell? What is the vision I'm prepared to share? And what are the commitments I want to hold myself accountable to, right? And so that I can feel like I know where I'm going. I know how I'm growing, that I am in a position to make change happen.
Nice, Ron. Ugh. We could be here for another hour talking about this. It's so enlightening to me. I mean, I'm one that if you can change my mind, because I'm real strong-minded. Some people say a little stubborn, but I say no. I really have learned so much just from listening to you and reading some things that I've seen, and I'm like, when is his book coming out? Like, what? When can I cop a copy of this book?
Well, so we're actually working on the guidebook, Illuminating the Vaccine for Racism, an actual guidebook, because we do want folks to understand racism is a solvable problem, right? And we want to get them the tools necessary to make change happen for themselves and their communities. And so we're hopeful to have the guidebook out hopefully early next year.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
I'm excited about
that.
that.
And our thing too is because, again, we're saying this is a vaccine for racism, our goal is to make the book freely available to everyone, right? That
Wow.
we truly believe you can't put barriers
Now I'm really getting
towards
a copy.
this. Well, I mean, think about it this way. I've always thought, like, if I have what I believed, again, to be a true sort of transformational way to help this world become better, why would I put a barrier on it, right? Why would I only ensure that folks who had resources, who had money, could get it?
Yeah.
Right. That
you want to put the vaccine in everyone's hand.
Everyone. I mean, and again, to give people an opportunity to say, hey, if you really want to make things happen, here it is, right? The rest is up to you, you know, and to the extent, too, that there are a lot of folks out there who are desperately wanting for things to change, right? That you can imagine a world in which even if you just, you know, support a smaller percentage of people with these tools, you're going to see systemic transformation.
You're going to see a change.
You're going to see change.
You have to.
And I'll say this, we have run more cohorts than I can even think of, and our data is conclusive because we run pre-assessments and post-assessments. That is, we run assessments of folks before they enter our cohort model, and then after they've gone through our cohort model, we run another set of assessments, and it's clear that people leave changed after they go through the Racial Equity Consciousness Institute. It's not just me. Like
it's actually changed.
Like there's very clear
research.
data for us.
That's great.
And again, it's very practical in nature because what people are recognizing is that they've never been exposed to this topic in this sort of deep critical thinking way, and giving them the tools to not just reflect on it, but to engage with other people. Realizing, again, you cannot transform society if you can't talk about the change you want to see. It's not possible.
This is catching on around the world.
Indeed.
You've been invited to United Nations. Like, I'm so excited. Like, you're going to South Africa. You got to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, so the United Nations opportunity was one where we had a chance to talk about this database that we've developed. It's called the Racial Equity Awareness Database, where we leverage the racial equity consciousness framework to really inform what are the most practical approaches to actually cultivating racial equity. Again, we want to move away from this sort of abstract thinking, you know, about racism to say, no, more practically, what are the policies, the practices, the initiatives, the interventions that are actually working to make meaningful change? And let's create a database so that we can share that information around the world. And so we had an opportunity to present that at the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent in Geneva, Switzerland. It was well received, and we're going to be building on that work. And then we're going to talk more about this work at a conference in South Africa. A conference focused on international remedies to racial inequality.
I love how you're like, Geneva, Switzerland. We just ran over there real quick, and then we're about to go to.
But I think it speaks to the fact that people are really hungry for solutions.
It's real stuff.
It's real.
It's a real solution.
It's a real solution to a global problem.
Yeah,
a
global problem.
And we're at the point now in our society where, we have the technology necessary to share information at the click of a button, right? And so we have to figure out, how do we get information on this really crazy issue of systemic racism to all the folks who are desperate to figure out how to make their communities and their lives better, right? And that if we can do that and do that effectively, we're going to see meaningful change in our time.
We're going to see it. I am now hopeful. I don't know how you changed me around, but I said, I think this could work. No, this could work. Like, all right, I'm behind it. And that was a hard nut to crack. So congratulations. If y'all want to learn more about this, which I know that you do, there's so much more, y'all. You can get so much deeper with it. Start your transformation. I really do believe that this is a solution. Tell them how they can get involved. How can they take the classes? What can they click on? I'm going to put all the links below. So just click away, y'all, and get to know more about this.
Absolutely. I encourage folks to visit crsp.pitt.edu/RECI. To learn more about the Institute and to access our online learning platform, which is also freely available to anyone who wants to learn deeply about how this works. Because again, we want to say, folks, we can do this. Mm-hmm. All right, we can do this. We can put ourselves in a position to really make dynamic change happen. So we encourage folks, visit the website, learn more about the framework, go through the reflective exercises. We host an annual academy for facilitators, people who want to facilitate learning community cohorts for their own community. We certainly want to be able to train them to do that. We host online learning forums where we exchange ideas and perspectives, and we're always looking for new ideas on how we can continue to improve and get the word out. And so certainly welcome any thoughts or ideas that folks might have in that space as well.
I've heard nothing but great feedback about the program. I am going to go through it and thoroughly get educated. So you said I want you to. And you said Crisp and Reese. I know exactly who they are, but I need you to say who Crisp and Reese and all that.
And for folks that don't know, the Center on Race and Social Problems, we're one of the oldest race-focused academic centers in the country.
Shout out to Dean Larry Davis, founder.
And shout out to our current director, the amazing Dr. Kaya Connor. And it's just an awesome, dedicated group of folks, who are committed to really understanding these issues that impact us along the lines of race and other social challenges, reminding ourselves that the society that we lived in was designed by human beings, and we as human beings can choose to design something different.
And what's your title? Because this is the most humble dude. I'm like, talk about yourself. Not really. I'm not going to. What's your title?
I try to tell folks I'm just happy to do the work, but at the center, I'm the Associate Director of the Center on Race and Social Problems, as well as the Director of Social Innovation in the Frederick Honors College, and the founding director of the Race Equity Consciousness Institute, as well as being an assistant research professor in the School of Social Work.
Hats.
But it all means the same thing, right? It's all just to focus on how do we.
You would have never said it unless I told you to. So I'm glad that you're saying that, because you were destined for greatness. Your parents were correct. You are greatness. You continue to do the good work. You're fighting the good fight. And you're calling us on the front line, like, let's go. Let's go. And the front line is not a battleground. No. It's like, it's a knowledge forum. Like, what? That's it?
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I think, again, I just tell folks, for all the folks that are watching, just if you can close your eyes and envision a world in which you and all the communities in which you can engage can talk openly and constructively and productively on the topics of race and racism, and work together to create solutions to ensure everyone can thrive. I want you to be reminded you have that capacity, right? That's not some sort of far-fetched idea. That's something we can all do if we work towards it. I mean, we got to the moon, for crying out loud. We can figure out how to work collectively on this, right? And so we just have to be willing, again, to investigate ourselves and say, how do I put myself in the best position to be an agent of change? And that's what the work we want to do, is to help people do that work.
Can you imagine the healing that will take place?
Amen.
When we say, let's start. Let's, maybe I don't, have these negative cognitions that this might not be able to work, but let me try and let me put my first foot forward.
Absolutely.
The amount of healing that will
Yes.
overflow into land after land after
Yes.
land.
Yes.
I look for that day, and the day is now.
Yes.
The day is here. I thank you so much, professor, teacher, scholar, director, man.
Just
Good guy.
fellow human. Fellow human, just trying to
Human.
make sure all my humans are doing all right.
Good-hearted dude, going out there fighting a good fight, doing the work. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming.
Thank you
on
for
my
having me.
show
Thank
and
you for
just
having
chopping
me.
it up with me.
I'm so excited, for the work that you've been doing. I've told you that I think this work is necessary. So much of our work really relies on great communicators, right, and great storytellers. And you're an amazing storyteller, an amazing communicator that will help inform the masses. And so grateful for what you're doing.
Thank you so much. And he'll never tell it, but he helped me form the team to get Healing Overflow onto Pitt campus after the dean said, heck yeah, we can do it. And then I said, okay, by myself, I don't think so. And Ron said, I help. Formed this wonderful team, Ian, Mary, and some social work students. And here it is on the Pitt campus. And we're able to broadcast out there. He ain't going to tell y'all, but for no cost at all. He helped assist out. So I appreciate that. All that you've done, all that you still do. He gives me ideas off the wazoo. He has this aerial helicopter view. And I'm like, I'm on the ground. He's like, yes, but look up here. We could do this. And I was like, okay. So I appreciate the teamwork that we have, and however we can help each other win.
Absolutely.
Anytime you need me, I'm here. And I already
Appreciate
know you got my back.
It's all love.
So
sure.
thank y'all. Hey, listen, I appreciate y'all pulling up your chair to our table, listening to Healing Overflow with Dr. Toy. Y'all been sharing it. Y'all been watching. You stopped me on the street. The love, y'all. The love that I'm receiving. Thank you so much. It's not for me. It's for us. Mm-hmm. And so thank you for listening. Thank you for healing. Thank you for sharing with other folks, because as you heal, your healing overflows onto everyone else. I will see y'all next time. Bye, y'all.